What happens when a president spends weeks insisting something is absolutely essential to national security, only to abandon the idea within a matter of hours? That's exactly what just happened with Greenland. For weeks, Donald Trump argued that the United States needed to control Greenland. He didn't frame it as a partnership or an expansion of cooperation. He framed it as ownership. According to him, nothing short of US control would satisfy American security needs in the Arctic. Then, in a single afternoon, that entire argument fell apart. Today we're going to walk through what actually happened, why it matters, and what this episode reveals about power credibility and the limits of political pressure. Because this was never really about Greenland. It was about leverage, influence, and how far a president could push before the argument collapsed under its own weight. This is North of MAGA. I'm your host, Pierre Shields. Let's dive in. The buildup, a hard line on Greenland. For months, President Trump maintained a firm and uncompromising position on Greenland. He claimed that Greenland was strategically vital to U.S. national security. He argued that Denmark could not adequately protect it. He suggested that American ownership was not just reasonable, but necessary, because of course he did. The message was blunt. The United States needed Greenland and it needed control. This was not framed as a negotiation, it was framed as a requirement. Trump repeatedly suggested that existing agreements were insufficient and that the only real solution was direct U.S. ownership of the territory. At no point did he offer a detailed explanation of why existing defense arrangements were inadequate. Instead, he relied on broad claims about security, influence, and American interests in the Arctic. And for a while, he stuck to that position. Yeah, for too long. The Davos speech and the cracks in the argument. The turning point came during Trump's appearance at the World Economic Forum in Davos. During a lengthy speech, lengthy of course, he laid out his view of global security and NATO. He argued that the United States had carried the burden of Western defense for decades and received little in return. He described Greenland as strategically essential and suggested that U.S. control would resolve long-term security concerns. However, the speech was filled with contradictions, because on one hand, he described Greenland, calling it Iceland, as critically important. On the other, he dismissed it as little more than an icy landmass. He warned about Russian threats in the Arctic, yet downplayed Russia's actions in Europe. He insisted ownership was necessary while offering no explanation for why existing military agreements were insufficient. Even before this reversal, the logic was already starting to unravel. I'm using the word logic here really loosely. Hi, it's us again. So we have been working hard on our merch stuff, right, Puppy? Puppy says, yeah, we've been working really hard on it. We have nice mugs. We have great t-shirts. If you have any ideas of what you'd like to see in the merch store, please let me know. The sudden U-turn. Then came the moment. Just hours after leaving the stage in Davos, Trump announced that he had reached the framework of a future deal regarding Greenland and the Arctic, following a brief meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Suddenly, there was no talk of ownership. Suddenly, there were no threats of tariffs. Suddenly, the demand that Greenland be controlled by the United States disappeared entirely. If ownership had truly been essential to national security, this reversal makes no sense. None of this makes sense. Why the argument collapsed. Once Trump ruled out military force and backed away from economic pressure, the foundation of his argument collapsed. European officials immediately pointed this out. Danish lawmakers questioned what justification remained for U.S. ownership if military action was off the table. Security analysts noted that the United States already has extensive access to Greenland under existing agreements. In reality, the U.S. already has the ability to operate military installations, expand radar and surveillance coverage, conduct Arctic operations, and strengthen defense cooperation. None of that requires owning Greenland. None of that requires owning Greenland. Once this became clear, the original argument no longer held together. Did it ever really hold together? Europe pushed back, and it worked. What changed the situation was not American strength, but European resistance. For years, many European governments attempted to avoid confrontations with Trump. They tried diplomacy, accommodation, and quiet compromise. This time they didn't. Yeah, they pulled a little bit of a Chamberlain move. Peace in our time kind of thing. Denmark refused to negotiate sovereignty. European allies backed Denmark publicly. NATO signaled unity. The message was clear. Greenland was not for sale, and sovereignty was not negotiable. Once that line was drawn, Trump's leverage disappeared. And shortly afterward, so did his demands. Taco. The NATO contradiction. One of the most revealing aspects of this episode was Trump's criticism of NATO. He argued that the United States had given far more than it had received. Yet history tells a different story. NATO's collective defense clause has only been invoked once in its entire history, and that was after September 11 attacks on the United States. In response, allies, including Canada, the United Kingdom, and Denmark, sent troops to fight and die. To fight and die alongside American forces in Afghanistan. That reality directly contradicts the claim that the US received nothing in return. It also weakened the credibility of Trump's broader argument. Trump, credibility. Yeah, maybe I should rephrase that. The real issue, power versus legitimacy. What this episode ultimately revealed is the difference between power and legitimacy. The United States has immense military and economic power, but power alone does not grant legitimacy. In the modern world, territorial claims require legal, diplomatic, and political justifications. Without that, even the strongest nations face resistance. Once Europe made it clear that Greenland's sovereignty was non-negotiable, Trump faced a choice. He could escalate dramatically, or he could step back. He choked. Trump choked. Why this is important. This episode is not just a political misstep. It showed that even powerful countries have limits. It demonstrated that alliances still matter, and it revealed how quickly bold geopolitical claims collapse when they're not backed by coherent logic. There are ironies that the United States does have legitimate security interests in Greenland. Absolutely. But those interests can be addressed through cooperation, not coercion. Carrot, not stick. And by walking back his demands, Trump effectively acknowledged that reality. Final thought. In the end, this wasn't a story about Greenland. It was a story about overreach. It was about what happens when rhetoric outpaces strategy, about how pressure fails when unity holds, and about how quickly political narratives fall apart when confronted with facts. Trump wanted Greenland. What he got instead was a reminder that in international politics, power still has boundaries. And sometimes the fastest way to lose an argument is to push too far. If you want clear Canada First analysis without the noise, make sure you subscribe to North of MAGA. If you found this breakdown useful, like the video and share it with someone who wants more headlines. Let me know in the comments, was this a smart retreat or strategic embarrassment? Thanks for spending time with me. I'm Pierre Shields for North of MAGA. Go play outside.